Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Gittin Daf Ayin Aleph. Because tomorrow is Tisha B'Av, I'm going to post both Shiurim one after the other, so that if you want to listen before Tisha B'Av, since the custom is not to learn Torah on Tisha B'Av, you can do that. But we're going to get started with our Daf. Amarav Kahana Amarav. So we started, let's just review for a quick minute. We were dealing with the case of the Mishnah where somebody can't speak, and people say, should we write against your wife? And he shakes his head yes. And then we check to make sure that he really understands what he's saying. If he does, and we talked about it, what kind of checks we do, then it's fine. So we can write a get based on the shaking of the head. Amarav Kahana Amarav. So Rav Kahana says in the name of Rav, a deaf person who can write, okay, and write us his wishes, is allowed to write and give a get to his wife. Now, what's the case here? So first of all, you have to understand some basics about marriages between people who are deaf. And when we say deaf, we mean a deaf mute. Someone who is in the category of cheresh shoteh katan, not just someone who can't speak or not just someone who can't hear, someone who can do neither, which at this point we think is in the same category as a cheresh shoteh katan. But Rav Kahana didn't say the truth is they're in a bit of a different category. And then we're going to distinguish here between they're in a different category because they can show us, if they write, they can show that they're of sound mind. And then we can actually do things. So they're not exactly the same as a katan and a shoteh. It's a minor and someone who's not of sound mind or doesn't have their intellectual capabilities with them. So Rashi now distinguishes, because the first thing you have to know is that when a person who is a deaf mute gets married, their marriage, whether he is or she is, it doesn't make a difference, because you need both in order to do the marriage. You need both their consent, since if they're not of sound, they're not with intellectual capabilities, as we generally say, a cheresh shoteh, then their marriage is only of rabbinic validity. So therefore, if it's a rabbinic validity, then the same way, and we're going to see this later, just like they get married with rimizot, like signing, indicating their interest, they also could get divorced that way. Their marriage is always on a rabbinic level. So the same way they go in is the way they go out. Marriage is rabbinic, divorce is rabbinic. But what if you have someone who is fine and could hear perfectly and speak and all that, or one of them anyway, let's say, but you had either both or one or the other, and therefore their marriage was on a Torah level, but then they became a deaf mute. And then we have a problem, because a deaf mute can only do things on a rabbinic level, and they have a Torah marriage that you can't get rid of with a rabbinic divorce. So that case, you actually can't do a divorce. Okay, that's a problem. We learned this in Yibam. So now Rav Kahana says in the name of Rav, if you're a cheresh, and Rashi says, of this category that we just discussed, was a pikach keshet kinsa, the kiddushav kiddushin gemuli. It was totally 100% legitimate Torah level marriage. He was fine, but then he became a cheresh. Now, if this person can show us by writing, if they can show us by writing that they have interest in giving this get, that makes it a Torah level divorce, and we can do it. So Rav goes far to say that yes, they're not like a minor or a shoteh. They can actually, by writing, indicate that they understand what's going on, and we can give the divorce to their wife. We're going to have 3 questions on this statement of Rav. The first is Rav Yosef. His question is of the sort of, why are you telling us this? We already know it from our Mishnah. My kamashman, Tanina, it already says in our Mishnah, nishtate, if he couldn't speak. As long as he shakes his head and understands what yes means, what no means, we can assume that he meant yes. So Amar la Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Zera says, what? In other words, the point is, why does Rav need to tell us this if the Mishnah says it explicitly? And the answer is very simple. Rabbi Zera says, Ilaim kamarta shani ilaim. The Mishnah is talking about someone who just can't speak, but not someone who's deaf. They're not in the same category as a deaf mute. They're just a mute. So, shani ilaim detanya, as we know already, midaber ve'eno shomeh hazeh cheresh. This is a different cheresh than ours. It's called a cheresh if you can speak but not hear. It's also called a cheresh if you're a deaf mute. It's very confusing in the Gemara because they interchange them, like right here in our sugya. And shomeh ve'eno midaber zeu ilaim. You hear and can't speak, that's ilaim. You only have one or the other, right? You can hear but can't speak, or can speak but can't hear. then you're considered a pikah. You consider with dad, with knowledge, you don't have any sort of issue with anything. So our Mishnah was talking about that, and Rav was talking about a chirei shelem, and that's why it's not a question. Since they already brought this up, the Gemara is going to ask, how do you know the medaber ve'eno shomea is a chiresh, and the shomea ve'eno medaber is an ilem? How do you know that? Dichtiv, v'ani kecharesh lo shma uchilem lo yiftach piv, lo yiftach piv. The pasuk says, cheresh lo shma, I won't hear, and an ilem lo yiftach piv doesn't open his mouth. So there you have it, very clear. Okay, it's a pasuk from from Tehillim. Sorry, looked at the wrong spot. I was thinking that's not from Vayikra. It's from Tehillim. Or there's another way to know that Ilem is someone who doesn't speak. Is people say Ishtakil Milule. Ilem is someone who loses his words, and the Ilem is an abbreviation for Ishtakil Milule. That's why you remember it. So that's how we know Ilem is someone who loses their words, they can't speak. So first question against Rav was, doesn't it say that doesn't it say it in the Mishnah already? And then we said, no, the Mishnah is talking about a different case. And Rav is going even farther to say, even if you were a deaf mute, we could do it through your writing. Now we're going to have another question, a different type of question. Amar le Abaye. No, before that, sorry. Amar Rabbi Zera, but Rabbi Zera, after answering the Rav Yosef's question, said, Ikashele hakash, Ikasheli hakash. If you have a question, this is really the question. Titania. Im lo yagid, pradli ilem sheno yachol lagid. Says, if you don't speak, you don't say testimony, this is a pasuk in Vayikra, if you don't say testimony that you knew about, then you have to bring a korban chata. Okay, if there was testimony you knew and you didn't come testify, you bring a sin offering. And this comes to exclude, because it says in lo yagid, if you didn't say, it comes to exclude milem sheino yachol lagid, a person who can't speak. Now why? He could have testified. Why shouldn't he be punished? He should have testified in writing. So if this whole thing is writing, should have done that. Amale Abaye. Abaye says, Edut kamarta? Shani edut derachman amar mipiya v'lo mipik tavam. You're comparing two different things. Our case is talking about telling someone to write again. That's not testimony. This is actually testimony. You can't testify in court by writing. It's a very interesting question, right? Can you or not? So why can't you testify in writing? Well, it says in the Torah, al pi, on the basis of, but pi means al peh, from the mouth of. You need to hear it said. Testimony doesn't work if you just wrote it. So that's a different story. And therefore, don't question from there to Rav, because that's a whole different thing. Now they say, wait a minute, what are you talking about, Abai? You're distinguishing edut, and edut can't be written, but telling someone to give a get can be written. If that's the case, we have a question from a Talmudic source. It says here, Hashem shabodkino to the Gittin, which is the person who can't speak and he shakes his head. Just like you could check him for a get, for business dealings, le'iduyot for testimonies, that seems pretty clear, and le'yerusha, and for inheritance issues. So katani miyat eduyot, says eduyot. So this is just a side question on Abai's answer to Rabbi Zera's question. Zera asked a question on Rav, Rabbi Yosef asked a question on Rav, Rabbi Zera answered. Rabbi Zera asked a question on Rav, Abai answers. But Abai's answer is a little bit weak. How can you distinguish edut and telling someone to write a get when this source, this Talmudic source, seems to clearly equate them? So Amar Rav Yosef, when it says eduyot here, it means specifically eduyot that a woman's husband has died to allow her to get remarried, because we're always lenient. But otherwise, we don't accept testimony in writing. V'hakatane, or by shaking your head. V'hakatane yurushot, but it also says property, inheritance. That's also what is he not testifying about someone's inheritance, that this belongs to someone who inherited from someone else, and that's also testimony. No, it's just him telling you that, for example, he doesn't want his oldest to get double. He wants the oldest to get the same as everyone else, and that's just telling something. It's more like kitvu get lishti, right, to get to my wife, but not right that this I'm testifying about someone. Katani miyat lamasodo matanot says business dealings. My love alma is that not testifying about business dealings between other people. Lo ledidi. No, it's talking about his own business dealings. And he could say, I want this, and he shakes his head, yes, and we can say that's a deal. But that's not testimony, in which case Abai's answer stands. So we had two questions against Rav, we answered them both. Third question, made today. when we allow deaf people to signal, okay, this is what we call sign language, right? And indicate what they want. Then we allow that, or even to write, we allow it by movable property, but we don't allow it by a get. So now it seems pretty clear we don't allow any sort of indication, right? This would be a problem against Rav. To which the Gemara answers, Tanaihi. It's a Tanaitic debate. Tanya, again, when we talk about deaf, we mean here deaf mute. Tanya, Rashbag says, no, what you just said is only if you were deaf from birth. Then I agree that it doesn't work to give a get. Aval, and we're going to question that in a minute also. Aval pikach v'nitcharesh hu kotev v'hem chotmi. But if he was a pikach when he got married and now he became deaf, exactly our case of Rav, and Rashbag is going to say exactly what Rav says, or Rav is really saying what Rashbag says, which proves that if it's a machloket Tanaim, we're going to say Tanakama says no, but Rashbag says you can do it. He writes and they sign. So there you see, it works. So now we've resolved all three questions against Rav, but the last one really put us in a corner because we said there's a clear Tanaitic source that goes against him. And then Rashbag disagrees, and that's what Rav answers. I hold by Rashbag's opinion. Now we're going to question Rashbag's opinion from two perspectives. We're going to have two issues with what Rashbag said. The first is, wait a minute. Didn't I already tell you today that if someone's married, if someone's deaf from the beginning and they get married, they can get divorced because the same way they get married, they get divorced. And now we're going to see it inside. Just like brings her into the marriage by alluding, by indicating, or maybe just simply sign language, then also he can divorce her, birimiza. So how could Rashbag possibly say, can't divorce his wife? To which he answers, you're right. If it was his wife, he really could divorce her. What we're talking about here is divorcing his yivama. What's the difference? Yivim tomiman. So what's the case of the yivama? Well, it can't be that the brother was deaf and he's deaf. Okay, we're going to have two deaf brothers. One died without children. She was married to him, which is a rabbinic marriage. Now she falls to Yibum, which is only Yibum on a rabbinic level because the marriage was only on a rabbinic level, to the brother who's deaf. He can bring her in because he can marry her, right, to Yibum and divorce her, no problem, because it's all rabbinic. So that definitely works. He goes in and out, right? She goes in and out with him signing or indicating. But it must be it must be that he's deaf, but his brother was not deaf. Now, when she married the brother, it was a Torah marriage. Now she falls to Yibum, to this deaf brother. He marries her, Yibum. That's done on a Torah level because his brother, right, he's continuing the marriage that was on a Torah level. But now he can't divorce her because divorce he can't do because he's Cheresh. So now, right, Cheresh Ilay, deaf mute. So now that would be the case that Rashbag says, I agree with you that a Cheresh and Yikara wouldn't be able to do this with his Yivama. Okay? To which the Gemara gives a second possibility, although they're going to reject it. We could say, once we establish this case where the brother's a pikach, and where we have two brothers, one is deaf and one is not, and the one who wasn't deaf was married and then died without children, and she goes to Yibum with the second one, it would be a big problem. So we're going to say, even if the first brother was deaf, even though if he was deaf himself and gave her a divorce, he'd be able to, but in the case of Yibum, we're not going to allow it. Why are we not going to allow it? Because maybe you'll confuse and think that if both brothers are deaf and she falls to Yibum, he can actually divorce her. We're not going to allow that because then what if one is deaf and the other's not deaf, right? If the first brother is not deaf, he can't divorce her, the deaf one, when he does Yibum. So therefore you might think, right, or the suggestion is, let's forbid when the brother, right, again, in both cases, she did Yibum with a deaf brother. So the question is just, what was the original husband? Was he deaf or not? So since that change makes all the difference, people might not realize that. So let's forbid any time the Yabam is deaf, whether his brother's deaf, his first, right, the original husband was deaf or wasn't deaf, it doesn't matter, because if we allow him to divorce her, in one case, we'll think he can divorce her in the other case. To which the Gemara has two questions with that option, and in the end, they're going to reject this. Okay, this is a little bit long, this section. So the first is kind of simple, which is Ihachi ishtonami. Well, then his wife also should be forbidden. In other words, any deaf person married to a deaf woman, or not to a deaf woman, married to any woman, doesn't really matter, right? If either of them are deaf, it's going to be only rabbinic. Any man married to, if he's deaf, should never be able to divorce his wife, because maybe you'll think then about the Yivama, right? If the Yivama can't get divorced, so why don't we make a Gzera from the wife because of the Yivama? So the Gemara answers the obvious, which is Yivim Tov Mechlafa, Ish Tov Yivim Tov Lo Mechlafa. We're not going to confuse wife and Yivama. That's already, right? We're only going to confuse Yivama with Yivama. The two cases where either her original husband was deaf or the original husband wasn't deaf, we're going to forbid one because of Yah. Umi, second question. But wait, this whole issue that you're saying, if she's married to a pikah and the marriage was Torah, and then she does yibum with the brother who's married, right? Who now the yibum is on a Torah level, they can't get divorced, right? I'm sorry. My mistake. If that case, she actually can never get divorced, right? Because she can't get divorced in that case, the one we just explained. The brother, original husband, was a pikah, and the Torah was Torah level. So now we're going to forbid, if the Yabam is deaf, we're going to forbid him from divorcing his wife, even if his brother was also deaf. The original brother was deaf and the whole thing was rabbinic. We're forbidding him to divorce her, right? That's the theory. That if both brothers, it's just very simple, it sounds a little complicated. If both brothers were deaf, even though theoretically you really could divorce her, the rabbis forbade. So now that's the theory here. And that's what Rashbag was talking about when he said Charesh Meikaro. Even that case, whether the original husband was Pikach or the original husband was Charesh, it doesn't make a difference. Either way, we're going to forbid one on account of the other, right? So the one who was deaf, when the original husband was deaf, really it would be okay for the second brother who's deaf, who did Yibum, to divorce her, but we're not going to allow it because you might confuse it with the case when his brother was actually not deaf, which would be a problem. But there's an explicit Mishnah in Yevamot, at the end of Yevamot, Daf Kuf Yud, that says, no, you actually can divorce when you have two brothers who are deaf. And even if just one was deaf, or even if just the wife was deaf, it doesn't matter. Any kind of case where it was a rabbinic marriage, including that both brothers were deaf, you can actually divorce her. Okay, and that's what this whole convoluted Mishnah is going to show. Okay, it's not so convoluted, it's just a lot of cases and it gets a little confusing, but it's not too bad. The Hatnan, we're now on Amud Bet. So we have two deaf brothers married to two deaf sisters, two not deaf sisters. Okay, again, this is going to give all possible permutations. The point being that both marriages are going to be rabbinic only, because each situation is going to be two brothers and two sisters. And in all situations, you're going to have both sets of marriages were only rabbinic. Okay, so either two brothers who were deaf married two sisters who were not deaf, or, which is kind of the case we've been discussing until now, or two sisters, the two women were deaf. In other words, either both brothers are deaf, okay, in the first section, we're going to keep that a constant. Both brothers are deaf, and the women are either both not deaf, or both deaf, or one and the other. Doesn't make a difference. There's two brothers, there's two sisters, and they married each other. And then, right, one's going to die, and the other's supposed to marry the wife. What's the problem? The wife is his wife's, right, the one he's supposed to marry, the Yivamat, is his wife's sister, and that's forbidden to him. Okay, but since everything was rabbinic, they're all forbidden to him on a rabbinic level, right? The arayot are forbidden on a rabbinic level, and the marriages are on a rabbinic level, and the Yibum obligations are on a rabbinic level. What happens in that case? Arayot overrides Yibum, and there's no chiyuv of Yibum or chalitza. Likewise, in the opposite case, which is the two sisters, and now we're going to switch all the possibilities of the men, of the brothers. They're nesuot l'shnei achim pikachim. They're either married to two brothers who are not deaf, or shnei achim chirshin, or both of the men are deaf, which already we had this case just on the other side, where we were focusing on first the men and then the wives. Or l'shnei achim echad pikach or echad chiresh, or one and one of the men. Either which way, again, since they're both deaf, all the marriages are only rabbinic. So there's no obligation of chalitza or yibum because of the isur arayot. Again, the isur arayot's rabbinic, the marriage, right? The Yibum obligation is rabbinic and it all is the same level. So that's going to override that without a problem. Right? As soon as they're on different levels, it becomes more complicated. And we saw those cases in Yivamot, but we're not getting into those today. Now, if they weren't sisters, then what would happen? Yichnosu. Well, there's no arayot there. So if they weren't sisters, they would all do yibum for their wife, right, for their brother's wife, if the brother died. And if they did yibum, imratzu lahotzian yotziu. If they wanted to divorce them, they could. Now, what do you see here? The brothers who are deaf, right? If there's two brothers who are deaf, one can divorce the yavama of the other, and we don't see that they made a gzeira in case the first one was pikeach. So that whole theory falls to the wayside. So it must be, like we just said, the first answer. So what have we done so far today? We had Rav's statement that a cheresh who can speak by writing, we do what he says, even if he's a cheresh lame. In fact, he writes, shows he could do this. We have 3 questions against him. By the third question, we said, you know what? This must be a Tanaitic debate. We brought Rashbag, who's on the other side of that Tanaitic debate, and agrees with Rav, as opposed to Tanakama, who doesn't agree. Okay, so we see it's a machloket where Rav says not everybody thinks that we can believe what he writes. And then we had this whole question on something else Rashbag said, which is a charesh mi'ikaro. He was deaf from the beginning, though, because this, what Rav said is only about someone who was married on the Torah level, was totally fine and became a deaf mute later and wants to get divorced now. So Rav finds a way for him to divorce his wife, okay? Even though Tanakama says he can't. But Rashbag agrees that if he was deaf from the beginning, he can't divorce his wife. Why not? It seems pretty clear he could, to which we explained it must be a case of yibum. And then we had to figure out what exactly are the parameters of this case of yibum. That's what we've done so far. The last part for this section is Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, again about Rashbag now. Halukim alav chaberav Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. You know, we might have thought this already. It was pretty obvious. We said it was a Tanaitic debate, and basically Rabbi Yochanan says it's a Tanaitic debate. Not everyone agrees with Rashbag. Okay, the rabbis disagree with him. Amar Abaye afana nami tanina. What do you mean? This is clear from a Mishnah. How so? It's a Mishnah in Yevamot. Nishtat lo yotzi. If a woman goes insane, it loses her mind capabilities, her mental capabilities, he can't divorce her. Okay, there's no way to give a divorce to someone who's not mentally capable, even though in divorce, we already said it's all the man. Doesn't matter the woman, because she just has to accept the get. Doesn't matter if she has mental capabilities. So the answer is going to be, we're going to see this later, it's only rabbinic. And the reason is so that she doesn't, we don't want her to be left on the street. We're worried that people will take advantage of her. So if you're married to a woman and she loses her mental capabilities, you shouldn't divorce her from a rabbinic prohibition because we're worried about leaving her out on the street. So now, and this is the important part, what if he becomes a deaf mute or he loses his mental capabilities? As we were talking about, someone who becomes deaf, that was our case. Lo yotzi olamit. You can't ever divorce her. Okay, which sounds like on a Torah level, right? And then my olamit, lav afagav diachol ledaber mitoch haktav. It sounds like this goes against Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and Rav, who said you can write, right? This sounds like olamit, no way, no how, forever. Sounds like there's no way he could do it even by writing. That's what they assume it comes to exclude. And then basically they're saying to Rabbi Yochanan, why are you telling us that the rabbis disagree with Rashbag? It's super clear that the rabbis disagree with Rashbag from this Mishnah, right? Don't tell us something we already know. So on Rav Papa, we're now going to have 2 explanations as to what we would have thought otherwise and why we need Rabbi Yochanan to say this. Ilav dashmina Rabbi Yochanan, if it weren't for him, I would have thought that Rashbag is coming just to explain Tanakama. And how would you explain the Olamit then? Umay Olamit, in other words, in the Braita that we saw, there were 2 opinions. You could just say, maybe Rashbag is saying, when is this case only when I agree with you and you agree with me even? But what you were talking about was someone who was deaf from the beginning. And then there was the whole Yibum case. But someone who wasn't deaf from the beginning, but was fine when they got married and then became deaf, they'd be allowed to write and pass on the information. So now they say, okay, so maybe Rashbag doesn't disagree. And then my Olamit, how do you explain Olamit then? Olamit, we said no matter what, meaning not even if they can write it. No. Olamit means something else. Even if we saw that he was very sharp, that wouldn't be enough. Okay, we can't allow that. But if he can write, that's a whole different story. Okay, and then we can explain it that way. Inami, second option, maybe it's coming for Rabbi Yitzchak. Let me just set it up outside first so you see, because the Gemara is kind of missing some important words. Rashi kind of fills them in, but I'm just going to explain it outside. Lo yotzi olamit is being compared to the woman's case, nishket. If she loses her mental capabilities, he shouldn't divorce her. But if he loses his mental capabilities, he can never divorce her forever. Now, what's the contrast? We thought never divorce even if he could write. No. If he could write, he can divorce her. But why do we say olamit? It's to contrast it with her. It's exactly to set up what I said before, which is if she loses her mental capabilities, it's only forbidden by a rabbinic level. And if he loses his mental capabilities, he can't divorce her even on a Torah, and that's on a Torah level. Not even only rabbinic, Torah level, he can't divorce her. Right? The main relevance would be if he did it anyway in the first case, if she lost her mental capabilities and he divorced her, it would be effective. But if you can't do it by Torah law, then it's not effective at all. So now, why is it coming to teach? What's it coming to teach us? What Rabbi Yitzchak said, and this is what I already told you, which is that you really could divorce a woman who lost her mental capabilities. Just like you could divorce a woman with mental capabilities against her wishes. So her wishes don't really matter. So it doesn't matter that she doesn't have mental capabilities. But why not? They didn't want people to treat her like hefker, turn her into a prostitute, right? You see, again, this idea of protecting women who need protection in society. They really understood that very well. Okay, so again, structure, we had Rav. We had 3 questions on Rav. We responded to them. In the third one, we basically brought up this Tanaitic opinion of Rashbag. We had 2 questions or 2 issues related to Rashbag. One was, what's he even talking about here? You know, that a Cheresh Mikaro can't divorce his wife. Of course he can, to which we explain we mean he can't divorce his Yivama. And then we had to understand what exact case. We gave 2 options. The second option, though, we rejected after we saw the Mishnah in Yevamot. Then Rabbi Yochanan came and said, Rashbag's friends disagree with him, meaning there's a Tanaitic debate here, even though we kind of knew that. And then we kind of say, we also knew this from a Mishnah in Yevamot. Why are you telling us this? And then we gave 2 explanations as to how to explain, number 1, the bride to where it seems they disagree. And then we could just say Rashbag explains Tanakama. And the second is to say that the second is to explain, and the other thing we had to do was explain the Mishnah when it says he can't divorce her olamit, which we thought meant no way, no how, even in writing. No, you'd have to say, right, maybe that could be understood in some other way, and that's why he needs to tell us, no, they really think he can't divorce her through writing either, and they really disagree with Rashbag, but it wasn't so clear from that Mishnah. Now we move to a new Mishnah. Amrulo, and that was our summary for the first part. Now we're going to just do the next part. We're almost done with our daf. Amrulo, nichtov get lishtecha. Should we write a get for your wife? But amar lahem ktovu. When he says yes, please write the get. Amrulo sofer. Okay, this, by the way, could be anyone who's about to go on a trip. It could be someone who's on their deathbed, and they say, maybe you want to write a get to your wife, and he says, write it. Amrulo sofer v'katav aleidim chatmu. If they said to a sofer, then he said, write it to them, and then if they said to a sofer, and the sofer wrote it, and they said to Eidim, and they signed it. Even if they wrote it, and it was signed, and they gave it to him, and even if the sofer wrote it, the Eidim signed it, they give it to this guy, and he gives it to his wife. Because why? Because he said to them write it, and not go tell somebody else to write it. It goes back to this topic we've been discussing before. It's only good until he says, La sofer ktov aleidim chatomu. He has to tell the sofer, you write it, and he has to tell the eidim, you sign it. If he said, you write it, he means you write it and sign it, okay? And unless he says someone else, you shouldn't ask anybody else. Now the Gemara is going to infer something from this Mishnah and then have some issues with it. Tama de lo amar tnu. Now it sounds like because he said write means write, but not give. If he said give, it seems like they would be able to ask other people. Now, what would this have to be based on? Now, let's go back to Rabbi Meir. What did Rabbi Meir say? Remember, Rabbi Meir says, Milin mimsarin l'shaliach. Right? He says, if you say to 3 people, tnu get lishti, remember, it's like you made them a court. And since you made them a court, they could go tell somebody else. Because even though it was just words, your request to do something can be transferred to somebody else, even if it's not a physical object. So that would make sense only really according to Rabbi Meir, and you'd have to say two things. Number one, he said tnu. Number two, he said it in front of three people, okay? Because that's when Rabbi Meir allows this to happen. To which the Gemara says, what do you mean? Ema Seifa, look at the end of the Mishnah. Ad shiomar l'safer k'tov aleidim chatomu. But it sounds like you have to specifically direct this one to do this and this one to do that. They can't pass anything on. Even if you just say k'tovu, it sounds like the most important thing is you have to directly set up the witnesses. Now, that is not Rabbi Meir. That is Atan Rabbi Yossi. Damar, mili lo nimserin l'shaliach. That, and now we have a problem with the Mishnah. The beginning part seems to match Rabbi Meir because it says k'tovu and not tnu, which means tnu should work. But then it says it only works if you tell them directly, which sounds like Rabbi Yossi. To which the Gemara answers very simply. First the Gemara questions. Reisha Rabbi Meir, Sefer Rabbi Yossi. You're going to say the beginning of the sentence is Rabbi Meir, the end of the sentence is Rabbi Yossi. Very hard to say that. To which the Gemara answers, no, not so hard to say that. Yeah, that's what you have to say. Reisha Rabbi Meir, Sefer Rabbi Yossi. Here it's a little bit more different than in some Mishnayot, because here it's really even one sentence. Really hard to split it up. And in fact, maybe that's why the Gemara is going to go through all sorts of calisthenics to try to prove that it's something else. So we're going to have Abaye now. Second answer. Abaye Amal, Kula Rabbi Meir. I'm going to explain the whole thing as Rabbi Meir. How so? And the Mishnah is just talking about a case that you didn't say tnu, but if you said tnu, in other words, when it says at the end, until you say to the sofer right and the edim katamu, unless you said tnu. To which the Gemara's obvious question is, it should have said then, it doesn't work, or the get is batel, unless you said tnu, until you say to them, give. And then once you say give, then they can pass it on to other people. So then they reject that. They try to explain it differently, that it's all Rabbi Meir, but it's talking about a case to lo amar b'beit tzlata. We made another assumption before, which is he said it in front of three. That's how it matches Rabbi Meir. Because Rabbi Meir says when you say tnu to three, it works. They can appoint shlichim. So now they say maybe it wasn't in front of three, it was only in front of two. The same question. Then it should have said, the get is batel unless you do it in front of three. And it doesn't say that, so that can't be the issue. As you say, the main part is missing if you go with these answers. So therefore, we're going to actually go in a different direction. We're going to forget the inference we made. We said k'tovu means right, but not give. Now we're going to explain it differently. Elekula Rabbi Yossi, the whole thing's Rabbi Yossi. Imru. What's the case? That they didn't say it's k'tovu, right? But he didn't say tell the sofer to write it. Okay, he just said you write it. You write it means you write it, and don't tell the sofer to write it. But if the case was where he said tell the sofer to write, then they could actually appoint a messenger. Even Rabbi Yossi would hold, even though generally you can't appoint a messenger. If you told them to appoint a messenger to write it, then they could. And you might remember this. We're going to have the exact same sugya, right? So now, ihachi ad shiomu imru mabayles. The first question is, it should have said again, the main part is missing. The get is batel unless he says imru lesofer, and then it would work. And Mode va'od mi mode Rabbi Yossi ba'omer imru. Remember we had this whole sugya. Does Rabbi Yossi really agree in a case where you say imru? Didn't we prove that Rabbi Yossi doesn't say that? And for that, we're going to quote this Mishnah on Pezayin, and we're going to explain it the way Rabbi Yirmiyah explained it, and then the way Rav Chisda explained it, and we're going to get into this whole thing again that we got into last time. I'll stop here right now for today, and we'll start with that whole quote next time about that Mishnah, where we prove from that Rabbi Yossi doesn't hold Omer Imru works. Rabbi Yossi really says the husband has to go directly to the sofer and command him to do it. He can't have a messenger pass it on. And then last time we were asking about Shmuel, and we just said, oh, Shmuel doesn't hold by Rabbi Yossi on that issue. Okay, so again, we had a Mishnah based on an inference from the Mishnah. We had a question. It seems like Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi, this Mishnah. So we said, oh, maybe it's all Rabbi Meir, but we had some issues with that. Then we suggested maybe skip that inference, say it's a different inference, and we tried to explain it all according to Rabbi Yossi, but we're going to have some problems with that, and we'll get back to this tomorrow and figure out how to resolve it. Like I said, tomorrow's Tisha B'Av, so the shiur for tomorrow will go up right after this shiur is posted, a little bit after. The next shiur will go up, and you can try to listen to them before Tisha B'Av. Have a great day, everyone, and have a meaningful fast.